fiat currency, and BitPay, a payment system for Bitcoin. Last week, the committee returned to hearing witnesses directly involved with one of the digital currencies, Bitcoin, the Bitcoin Embassy, the Bitcoin Alliance of Canada, and the Bitcoin Foundation. Today, we are pleased to welcome Mr. Andreas Antonopoulos, considered to be the Bitcoin guru. Suggested to us by several previous witnesses, Mr. Antonopoulos is both an entrepreneur and author in the field of Bitcoin. He is a computer sciences graduate from University College London. His expertise includes Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, information security, cryptography, cloud computing, data centers, Linux, open source, and robotics software development. He has had over 200 articles published in print and is syndicated worldwide. In addition, he is a certified information system security professional for over 12 years and is a permanent host on Let's Talk Bitcoin, a webcast devoted to Bitcoin. Mr. Antonopoulos is also a prolific public speaker, recently appearing at the Toronto Bitcoin Expo held earlier this year, which I must tell our committee, our analysts attended. He has literally, members of the committee, written the book on Bitcoin, which is entitled Mastering Bitcoin, Unlocking Digital Currencies. It is with great pleasure that I turn the floor over to Mr. Antonopoulos for his opening remarks, to be followed by your astute questions. Mr. Antonopoulos, welcome. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chair and committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to these proceedings about digital currency. My experience is primarily in information security and network architecture. I have a master's degree in networks and distributed systems and have worked in the field since 1992. I spent 20 years working on networks and data centers for financial services companies before I found Bitcoin in late 2011. I've been working full-time in the Bitcoin space for the past 2 years and written a book on Bitcoin for software developers. Today I welcome the opportunity to talk to you about Bitcoin security, the decentralized architecture that underpins Bitcoin security, and the implications that architecture has for privacy, individual empowerment, innovation, and regulation. Until the invention of Bitcoin in 2008, security and decentralization seemed like contrary concepts. Traditional models for financial payment networks and banking rely on centralized control in order to provide security. The architecture of a traditional financial network is built around a central authority, such as a clearinghouse. As a result, security and authority have to be vested in that central actor. The resulting security model looks like a series of concentric circles with very limited access to the center and increasing access as we move further away from the center. However, even the outermost circle cannot afford open access. In such a security model, the system is carefully protected by controlling access and ensuring that only vetted individuals and organizations can connect to it. The entities near the center of a traditional financial network are vested with enormous power, act with full authority, and therefore must be very carefully vetted, regulated, and subject to oversight. Centralized financial networks can never be fully open to innovation because their security depends on access control. Incumbents in such networks effectively utilize access control to stifle innovation and competition, presenting it as consumer protection. Centralized financial networks are fragile and require multiple layers of oversight and regulation to ensure that the central actors do not abuse their authority and power for their own profit. Unfortunately, the centralized architecture of traditional financial systems concentrate power, creating cozy relationships between industry insiders and regulators, and often lead to regulatory capture, lax oversight, corruption, and in the end, financial crises. Bitcoin and other digital currencies based on the blockchain architecture are fundamentally different. The security model of blockchain currencies is decentralized. There is no center to the network, no central authority, no concentration of power, and no actor in whom complete trust must be vested. Instead, the core security functions are put in the hands of the end users of the system. In this architecture, security is an emergent property of the collaboration of thousands of participants in the network, and not the function of a single authority. In addition to the differences in architecture, there are also fundamental differences in the nature of the payments themselves. Digital currencies like Bitcoin are much more like cash than bank accounts or credit cards. The transfer of value in Bitcoin is a push mechanism, not a pull mechanism, as is the case with credit cards, debit cards, and most other digital payments. A Bitcoin payment is not an authorization to pull from your account. Instead, it pushes the precise payment amount itself as a value token directly to the named recipient. A single transaction does not authorize any future transaction or expose the user's identity. The transaction itself is unforgeable and unchangeable. As a result, Bitcoin payments can be transmitted in the clear without encryption over any network and can be stored on unsecured systems without fear of compromise. Bitcoin's unique architecture and payment mechanism has important implications for network access, innovation, privacy, individual empowerment, consumer protection, and regulation. If a bad actor has access to the Bitcoin network, they have no power over the network itself and do not compromise trust in the network. This means that the Bitcoin network can be open to any participant without vetting, without authentication or identification, and without prior authorization. Not only can the network be open to anyone, but it can also be open to any software application, again without prior vetting or authorization. The ability to innovate without permission at the edge of the Bitcoin network is the same fundamental force that has driven Internet innovation for 20 years at a frenetic pace, creating enormous value for consumers, economic growth, opportunities, and jobs. Bitcoin's decentralized nature affords consumer protection in the most powerful and direct way by allowing Bitcoin users direct control over the privacy of their financial transactions. Bitcoin does not force users to surrender identity with every transaction and put their trust in a chain of supposedly vetted intermediaries who must be trusted to control access to, securely store, and protect transaction data and vulnerable account identifiers. Bitcoin transactions never expose vulnerable account identifiers, and Bitcoin users can protect the privacy of their transactions without relying on or trusting any intermediaries. Because in Bitcoin trust is not vested in central actors, there is no need for centralized regulation and oversight. When properly architected, Bitcoin financial services are not vulnerable to central point of failure, which would necessitate heavy-handed oversight and regulation. Instead, the power lies with the end user, whose interests are most aligned with the protection of their own funds. While individual Bitcoin wallets can be targeted and compromised, if not properly secured, the Bitcoin network does not suffer from centralized systemic risks. Contrary to popular misconception, Bitcoin is not unregulated. Rather, several aspects of the Bitcoin network and financial system are regulated by mathematical algorithm. The algorithmic regulation in Bitcoin offers users predictable, objective, measurable outcomes, such as a predictable rate of currency issuance. These outcomes are not subject to the whims of centralized institutions or committees, which are both corruptible and often placed outside of democratic oversight. A Bitcoin user can predict the monetary supply 30 years from now, instead of hanging on the nuanced intonation of a single adjective by some high official of central banking who can dramatically change an entire country's monetary velocity a week hence. Bitcoin's decentralized architecture does not easily conform to the expectations and experiences of consumers or regulators because there has never been a large-scale, secure, decentralized network before. The combination of decentralization and security is the novelty at the heart of Bitcoin. In trying to understand consumer protection, oversight, audit, and regulation of Bitcoin, there is a risk that many will try to apply familiar models of the past to this new digital currency system. These models are all centralized and designed to provide regulation and oversight of centralized financial networks. Centralized solutions will be easier to understand and seem familiar. However, they are both inefficient and unsuitable for this new form of decentralized financial network. I urge you to resist the temptation to apply centralized solutions to this decentralized network. Centralizing Bitcoin will weaken its security, dull its innovative potential, remove its most disruptive yet also most promising features, and disempower its users while empowering incumbents. Consumer protection will not be achieved by removing Bitcoin's built-in privacy characteristics. Demanding user identifiers and adding access control mechanisms on top of the Bitcoin network, and then trusting those identifiers to a chain of intermediaries, will only replicate the failures of the past by introducing single points of failure into a network that has none. We cannot protect consumers by removing their ability to control their own privacy and then asking them to entrust it in the same intermediaries who have failed them so many times before. Most failures in Bitcoin security are the result of misguided attempts at centralization and removing control from the users. In the new decentralized financial network, we have the opportunity to invent new decentralized security mechanisms. Based upon innovations such as multi-signature escrow, smart contracts, hardware wallets, decentralized audit, and algorithmic proof of reserves. These are the new decentralized regulatory and security tools that are most appropriate for a decentralized digital currency. Thank you for the opportunity to address this committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Antonopoulos, for your opening remarks. They have clearly resonated, stimulated a number of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Antonopoulos, for being here. I'm finding very real interest in what you have to say. Let me outline, first of all, what I'm hoping to come to understand from you. I'm interested in coming to learn what is needed to ensure that this innovation can continue to develop. So that's my premise, right or wrong. But I do, building on the Chairman's initial comments, have a question or two for you. When CA Vertex testified before this committee, they stated that they'd like to see Bitcoin regulations put in place as soon as possible to give clarity on how Bitcoin is classified. They believe, they told this committee, that this would allow Bitcoin to thrive in Canada. In your remarks, you've stated that Bitcoin should not be regulated centrally because it will stifle innovation. Considering that other groups have echoed the statements of CA Vertex, help me with the disconnect that I'm hearing between the evidence of CA Vertex and what you have said today.
Absolutely. I believe that the best way to help Bitcoin is to ensure that there is clarity in the treatment of Bitcoin and that Bitcoin is not essentially forced into contorting itself into regulatory structures that are designed by banks for banks or with traditional models of finance in mind, which are primarily centralized, and recognizing that Bitcoin as programmable money with capabilities such as digital multi-signature escrow has many more flexible ways of responding to the needs for consumer protection. For example, in the traditional banking environment, unless you hold cash, every account that you have as a consumer is a custodial account. That means that the account funds are held in trust by a bank, and what you have in return is essentially a promise note that that money will still be there tomorrow morning. The bank controls the funds entirely. Bitcoin allows a much more varied range of control between a consumer and a financial services institution that they may use, from completely decentralized control where the consumer or end user is the only one with full control over the money, to complete custodial accounts where a financial services institution has full access to the keys and the consumer has none. In between, there are also models that are hybrid, where the bank may have a signatory role but not be able to change the direction of the funds, simply to approve transactions. And so within this very broad range of possibilities, obviously some aspects of that do need to be regulated. What I mean by that is, if you simulate a traditional financial environment with a custodial account where you take full control of a user's funds, then those funds are now outside of the Bitcoin security model. They are no longer protected by the user's control of the keys. They're no longer protected by the blockchain. They are now in a gray area where they're not covered by regulatory requirements for capital adequacy audits, security requirements and controls, etc. But they're also not covered by Bitcoin's security model. And we've seen that whenever that has happened, it results in disaster. Almost all of the exchanges that have been attacked in Bitcoin had a full custodial model like that. However, that is not the only model that exists. There are digital Bitcoin wallets where the user has complete control. There are wallets where the user has complete control, but transactions cannot happen unless an additional signature is placed by an institution that acts essentially as a risk manager to ensure that even if the user's systems are compromised, their money can't be stolen, a hybrid model. If you lump all of those together under a single unifying regulation, assuming it's all just like a bank, then you miss out on the opportunities to create better solutions with this new programmable money. So I do believe that certain models of Bitcoin use must be regulated. If control over the user's funds has been centralized, then that institution puts consumers at risk. But to lump a decentralized model where a user still has full control over their funds and an institution can't steal their money under that same regulation is not only misguided, but doesn't leave any room for that technology to develop further.
May I ask one further question? Thank you very much for that. So what would you suggest to this committee in terms of regulation, if any?
I believe we're still at the very early stages of this technology. Not only is Bitcoin new, but Bitcoin is already evolving. For example, the capability to do multi-signature transactions where there can be up to 20 different signatories on a single transaction, and a transaction can be controlled by any mixture of signatures. That technology was introduced in 2012, 4 years after the introduction of Bitcoin, and came into full fruition or full availability in 2013. So already Bitcoin is developing new and exciting programmable capabilities for user security. I think this technology needs time to breathe. It needs time to show the full potential of what is possible with decentralized programmable money. Until that time, I think opening up those possibilities by making clear distinctions where the technology allows it between centralized and decentralized modes of operation, for example, understanding those nuances can create niches where new players can come into the financial services market and introduce innovation, competition, and quite honestly, disruption into the banking industry by trying out new models for consumer protection, which in my opinion are superior to the ones we have today.
So your answer is what in terms of what this committee should do, if anything?
Wait until the technology is better understood by all of us, and understand that there are nuances in this technology that require very careful treatment, because a blanket treatment as if this is just a currency, which it is not, it is a network for money, a treatment as if there is only one application, the Bitcoin currency, which it is not, there are many applications based on this model, would stifle this technology in its early days.
Thank you very much.
I remember when I got an IBM Selectronic that had the X backspace, so I could correct letters, and I thought, nothing's ever going to be cooler than this. It's impossible. And that's my, I'm 67, that's my generation. Would it be fair to say to you, and you say it needs some breathing space, I'm asking you, would it be fair to say that the younger generation gets this more so than my generation?
With any new technology, I think that's the case.
And do you think it fair to say, for instance, I would doubt very much that I will get into Bitcoins. I don't really understand it even still, and we're on our 11th meeting.
We're lucky Paul does.
But Paul, yeah, Senator Massicott does. But I know that when I talk to people, younger people, about this committee, they totally get it. Like, they don't have any questions at all. They're like, this is where we're going. This is how we're going to get there. And in fact, I've been told to keep my old nose out of it. Because, and I think you explained it, how much time does it take to breathe for this? How long do you think that would be? I mean, how rapid is this going to come upon us?
I would estimate that Bitcoin today is approximately in the same position that the Internet was in 1992. And in 1992, when I used email, it required command line Unix skills typed into a mainframe, and it was very, very difficult.
Yes.
Approximately 10 years after that, it had already reached mainstream adoption among especially younger people. And almost exactly 20 years after that, my mother got her first iPad and was able to send her first email. It took some while until the technology went from something extremely esoteric that was only the purview of someone working in a computer science department, until my mother could do it with a swipe of her finger, and she's a self-acknowledged technophobe. And so it may take some time. What I can tell you for sure is I think this one's going to be about 3 times faster, and that's because we're not deploying physical infrastructure, and we already have the internet as a medium on which we can spread this technology. So I believe that within 8 years we're going to see very mainstream applications that are going to be much easier to use and secure, that will allow consumers to use Bitcoin in a way that feels very comfortable, and at the moment we're not there.
Okay, just one more question. The question I have is that if you don't need any centralized oversight, who provides? I mean, you say, well, the front end user and the end user control the whole thing. If there is nobody finding out who is the front end user, how can we be so sure that we won't see ISIS or one of these other whack job crews use this as a method of transferring money around the world?
I firmly believe that the possibility for positive use of this technology so far outweighs the very small possibility for negative use of this technology. The truth is that ISIS is probably using pallets of money that they stole from allies during their reign of terror, and not Bitcoin. I think it's really a matter of understanding that to limit a technology that has the possibility of bringing economic inclusion to billions of people who do not have it today, in the same way that cell phone technology allowed entire nations to leapfrog the landline and land in a technology realm and achieve communications that would be unthinkable. Bitcoin can do the same for banking and finance, and it can empower billions of people around the world in areas such as remittances, international finance, international credit, accessing liquidity, accessing loans, and things like that. And as with any technology, this technology will reflect society, and there will be a tiny minority who will try to use it for evil. But I have full faith that the law enforcement capabilities, properly exercised, can follow funds on Bitcoin just as they can in the normal financial networks, probably more so than they can in traditional financial networks. Furthermore, I think Bitcoin is the most open and transparent of cryptocurrencies. There are already 500 others, and I believe that if Bitcoin is not given the opportunity to work in a way that empowers people, eventually criminals will move to far more stealthy and far less open currencies and use those instead.
Okay, thank you very much for coming today.
Just amazed by it. One of the things I was thinking about last night as I was reading your paper, the idea that occurred to me was that, and I want you to comment on it, is that Bitcoin and related currencies is not hackable because there is a nothing to hack. Is that a true statement? And I wonder if it is, if you could explain that in very simple terms, because I imagine there are a lot of people watching this.
Individual Bitcoin wallets, my wallet, can be hacked. And in fact, we see examples of that. The system as a whole cannot be hacked. And the reason I say that with confidence is because over the last 5 years, and especially recently in the last year and a half, with value transferred over that network exceeding $5 billion US dollars, there has been no shortage of people trying to hack Bitcoin. In fact, if anything, what we've seen is that Bitcoin has changed the very dynamics of cybercrime and hacking. It has escalated the attacks. It has created a target for hackers that is extremely fluid, that resides on people's computers, and they have tried to take advantage of that. I know that Bitcoin can't be hacked simply because many people have been trying non-stop for the past 5 years and can't hack it. So there's a very big difference between the system as a whole, which is a dynamic system that responds to hacking attacks, and individual wallets. And I think you see a very similar development timeline as with the internet. I remember a time when groups of hackers could take down Yahoo for a day, and Microsoft and Google, and they don't do that anymore.
No.
And that's not because they stopped trying. It's because a dynamic system that is constantly exposed to threatening stimuli will develop resistance and will become more and more resistant to these types of attacks. A concept often called anti-fragile. It becomes dynamically stable and resistant to attack. And Bitcoin is not static. It continuously evolves, and it continuously deals with attacks better and better over time.
Thanks very much. It's very interesting. You mentioned in the answer to the previous questioner that there are roughly 500 other cryptocurrencies. Mm-hmm. What is the size of Bitcoin in relation to those? Are they major competitors, or are they copycats?
I would say for the most part they're copycats. My personal opinion is that the allocation of cryptocurrencies in terms of market size, adoption, users, etc., follows a long tail or power law curve, where the vast majority is concentrated in a few top, maybe a handful of currencies, and then you have potentially a tail that stretches out to encompass thousands of smaller currencies. And the dynamic of being able to create currencies at whim creates an environment where there will be literally thousands, possibly tens of thousands of currencies in the future. Only a handful will have economic viability and market value, but that doesn't change the nature of it. In my opinion, people will create currencies the way they create internet memes. So in many cases, they will be internet memes, and we've seen that happen in currencies. So what's happening here is a laboratory of evolution and innovation where new ideas are tested, and some of the best results of that are often catastrophic failure on a small scale that informs future designs for Bitcoin.
It's amazing. Do you foresee a time when, in the interests of economic development or what have you, that a nation state decides to forego its own currency and adopts Bitcoin?
That's a difficult question because I think the very nature of currency is changing. And so I think the, if you like, economy or organization that is adopting the currency is the internet, and that's a transnational entity. I think that has even more important implications for the future than national currencies. Bitcoin is already bigger than some national currencies, and in the future may end up being more important for economic activity than dozens of smaller national currencies. I do foresee that in the future, national central banks may utilize blockchain technology to underpin a national digital currency.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Green.